They gave up their adopted daughter as if she were nothing more than an animal to be traded, an extra mouth they could no longer tolerate. To her face, their words cracked like whips. She's no use to us anymore. And just like that, handed over as if she were little more than a broken tool, Senna was thrown into the arms of chance. To the villagers who gathered in curious silence, she was a shameful burden passed along. To Senna herself, she was humiliation incarnate, proof that the love she had long begged for was never truly hers. She stood with trembling hands and a heart bruised by years of rejection, certain the next chapter could hold nothing but more of the same. But that was when fate intervened. What she did not know, what no one could have predicted, was that Amadou, the solitary young man at whose doorstep she had been discarded, saw her differently. Where the others saw a burden, he saw a heart that looked too much like his own. He who had been left behind, who had known loneliness sharper than knives, could never look into her broken eyes and see waste. What began in cruelty would twist itself into something new. This exchange, dismissive to everyone else, was the fragile seed of an unexpected bond that neither village gossip nor scorn could smother. By the time the sun began slipping behind the hills, the scene was already sealed. Dorna, Zila, and old Rufino shoved Senna out of their house without a second thought, like tossing rags onto the road. She carried no brightly painted suitcase, no trinkets of memory. Only a sagging cloth bag stuffed with the cast-off dresses of her foster cousins, clothes that had always been too big or too small for her, never meant to fit her life. Each step she dragged was heavy, not with fabric, but with the hollowness growing inside her chest. She had never been truly welcomed in that house. She had always been the other one, the extra body, the one whose worth was calculated in bowls of rice served and chores done. Yet even with years of contempt behind her, the finality of that shove out the doorway cut sharper than expected. The red dirt road stretched out before her, narrow and flanked with tall grass that bowed to the evening breeze. Birds that had once filled those meadows with song were already silent, leaving only the crunch of her own sandals. To Senna, it was not a walk. It was a march of shame. Dorna led the way, stiff as iron, pretending this was discipline rather than disposal. Behind, Rufino muttered for all the night air to hear. No sense wasting rice on one who brings nothing in return. Those words burrowed under her skin. Too ashamed to reply, Senna lowered her head and let silence choke her. At that moment, she no longer existed as a person. She was only what they named her. One more mouth too many. They reached Amadou's home at the far edge of the village, a modest hut that carried the scent of river silt and smoke. Amadou sat on its step with a fishing net knotted between his fingers, calloused hands untangling rope with patient strength. He was not a man of many visitors, let alone of company delivered in such cruel fashion. When he noticed the small group marching toward him, his brow drew tight, and he wiped his palms against his trousers before slowly rising to his feet, and Zila barely slowed her pace. Dropping the bag into the dirt with a hollow thud, she snapped, "Here she is. If you want her, keep her. She's no use to us anymore." Dust rose like a curtain, thin, gray, shameful. Senna stood frozen, her small body hunched inward, eyes red, not only from tears long held back but from the fear of what awaited her now. Around her, silence pressed down, until Rufino broke it with a bitter grunt. "Better she weigh you down here than weigh us down at home." And then, done. Just as easily as a hand brushing dust off a table, they turned and walked away. No final glance, no words of parting, only retreating backs and footsteps swallowed by the road. From nearby fences, villagers peeked, their whispers thin but sharp. "Well, well, even a reject has a taker now." Their muffled laughter carried farther than shouts could. To Senna, it felt like knives cutting what little pride she had left. Her bag lay sprawled on the ground like a witness, testifying to her disgrace. She longed for the earth to open and swallow her whole. But then, another gaze met hers. Amadou had been silent through the cruelty, but his eyes were different. No contempt, no cheap pity, only a stillness, as though he recognized something of himself in her broken body. He scratched the side of his head and finally spoke in a voice low and steady. not loud so as to echo, but warm enough to crack the ice between them. "Come in. Here we don't speak of burdens, here we don't speak of leftovers. Come in and rest." At first, Senna could not believe she had heard him right. After years of insults etched into her bones, was this kindness real? Still trembling, she bent to gather her bag, but Amadou stepped forward, lifted it himself, and held open the door. "This is not a place for rejection," he added, almost as if reminding himself. For the first time in her life, those words pulled a thread of hope through the tapestry of despair. Inside, his home was small. Mud walls, uneven dirt floor, one straw mat neatly folded in the corner, the bare necessities of survival. Yet to Senna, it already felt richer than the house she'd just been cut loose from. There was no furniture to boast of, no food in pots to smell, but there was something her former family had never given: dignity. Awkward and unsure, she folded herself quietly near the door, small as a sparrow bracing for the next blow. Outside, the whispers of neighbors still pricked her ears. Inside, all was hushed. Yet the silence here was different. Empty, yes, but not hostile. Amadou lit an oil lamp, its flame painting the walls in soft amber light. It spilled across her face, revealing swollen eyes, tired lips pressed thin, and shoulders slumped with years of bearing grief far too heavy for so young a girl. And then, as if the lamp itself had coaxed it out of her, the tears came. She could no longer hide them. Silent sobs spilled, darkening the fabric of her skirt. Amadou said nothing at first. He opened a chest, removed a folded cotton blanket, and stepped near to lay it gently around her shoulders. "No one here calls you a burden," he murmured, half to her, half to the air. The words hit like thunder in her chest. For years, every waking moment had been chained to the opposite mantra: burden, dead weight, waste. And now here was someone ripping that chain apart with simple truth. I don't know why you're treating me like this," she whispered, voice breaking. Amadou eased down onto a stool nearby, elbows on his knees, his eyes steady, his tone quiet but heavy. "Because I know. I know what it is to have no one. To not be wanted. Even in the place where love should have been." Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that filled the small hut. No grand declarations, no false comfort, just truth that carried weight. Outside, dogs barked in the distance, leaves rustled. The village wound down in sleep, but inside, for the first time in Senna's memory, silence dared to feel like shelter rather than emptiness. She looked around. The home was poor, yes, but that poverty carried no cruelty. She lay down on the mat, the blanket tight around her, and let the words replay in her mind. "No one here calls you a burden." Hands clasped softly, she whispered a prayer she had once dared say only in secret back at Nzila's. "If I stay, let it be for peace. If I must leave, let it be never to return to shame." And then, for the first time in countless years, she let sleep take her without fear. That night was no festival, no feasts, no laughing fires, no promises. It was silence, hidden tears, and one simple act of warmth. Yet sometimes, hope is born not in trumpets, but in whispers. And on that first night in Amadou's home, Senna learned, the greatest comfort is not in grand words, but in the absence of cruelty. The rooster crowed, its raw cry cutting dawn into the hills. Amadou was already awake, his net slung across his knee, preparing for a day's work. Senna stirred slowly, her body heavy from exhaustion, but her heart startlingly light, lighter than it had ever been. For the first time in her life, she did not wake to someone calling her useless, to voices hurling dead weight. She woke to silence. And silence had never tasted so much like peace. The house was simple, made of mud and wood. But within that small space, there was a peace she had never known that as she quietly adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, she watched Amadou handling fishing nets and sacks of seeds. The silence between them was no longer awkward but meaningful. It was as if they both understood that two wounded souls had found each other there. Two survivors of different stories marked by the same pain, rejection. When the sun was already warming the dirt road, Amadou came closer. He sat beside her, resting his callous hands on his knees, and after a long sigh began to speak. "I wasn't born alone in this world," he said, his voice low almost. "I had a mother and a father, but I never had a home. They never wanted to see me as a son. Just a burden that poverty made impossible to carry." Sina looked up, surprised by the confession. Amadou rarely spoke of himself. Everyone in the village knew how reserved he was. But in that moment, the words flowed as if they'd been trapped for years. "I grew up sleeping in backyards, eating leftovers, working since I was little to prove I was capable, but it was never enough. There was always someone to remind me I was worthless." He ran his hands over his face as if trying to wipe away the bitter memories. "When I was old enough to run with the other boys, I ran alone. When parents called their children to eat, I stayed back. One day, I just stopped going home. I thought I'd starve, but I survived. Worked wherever there was work, planted wherever there was land. Since then, I've learned silence is more loyal than any promise made with words." Amadou's words fell over Senna like a mirror. Each sentence he spoke echoed the pain she carried, the emptiness of not being loved where one should be, the cold of sleeping without belonging to anyone, the shame of being labeled a burden. It was as if God had brought two wounds together so that one could understand the other. Senna discreetly wiped away a tear. "I know what that's like," she whispered. "I also lived among people who gave me food but never gave me a place. I grew up under a roof but I never had shelter." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but there was strength in her eyes. It was the first time she had ever spoken aloud the truth. She had swallowed in silence for so many years. Amadou nodded slowly. "Then you understand what it's like not to be wanted where you should be loved. It's a pain that leaves a mark, but it's also the kind of pain that teaches us to see others." He looked at Sina, and in his gaze there was more than solidarity. There was recognition. It was as if he said without needing more words, "You're not alone." The rest of the morning passed in quiet work. He tended to Thieland. She swept the yard and helped organize the small kitchen. Neither spoke much, but every gesture, every shared task grew an invisible thread between them. As the day went on, Senna began to realize she wasn't standing beside a stranger, but someone who bore the same scars she did. In the afternoon, as the sun lazily dipped in the sky, they sat at the doorstep. Silence returned, but now it wasn't empty. It was a silence of understanding. Sina looked out toward the horizon and thought about all she had lost, but also about everything she was beginning to gain. For the first time, she didn't feel like a burden beside someone. Amadou broke the silence with a quiet voice. "Sina, I don't know what the future holds. I only know that in this house, you will never be called leftover. Not today, not tomorrow." Those words sank deep into her heart, like seeds falling onto dry soil. And even though the past was still painful, in that moment, a small hope was born. Maybe life had finally given her not just a roof, but a companion in pain and in struggle. The sun slipped behind the hills, and the night brought its chill. But inside that little house, for the first time, Sina didn't feel only the cold on her skin. She felt warmth in her heart. The following days were a time of adjustment. Senna still walked with a tight heart, as if at any moment someone might knock on the door to take her back to the house where she had always been treated as a burden. But Amadou, in his quiet calm, offered small gestures that planted the seeds of trust. He didn't speak much, but every time he handed her a plate of food, every time he took the water bucket from her hands to ease the weight, Senna felt a kind of care she had never known. Even so, it didn't take long for the village to notice their new living arrangement, and soon the people's tongues began to move like fire through dry grass. On a market morning, as Senna walked beside Amadou, whispered chatter turned into open remarks. On one side of the street, two women paused their corn-shucking just to comment. "Look at that. Two rejects walking together. What kind of future can come from that?" On the other, a group of young men leaning in the shade of a mango tree laughed mockingly. "He couldn't get a wife until now, and now he's got one no one else wanted. Perfect match." The words spoken in scorn pierced Sina's heart like arrows. She lowered her eyes, that same old shame washing over her. It felt as if she were being weighed and discarded all over again. This time in full view of the village. Every step through the market felt like a trial. Amadou noticed her tension and, without raising his voice, simply touched her arm firmly as if to say, "Walk with me, let them talk." But the whispers kept coming. Some laughed behind their backs. Others shook their heads in disapproval, as if the union between them was an offense to the village's sense of order. On the way home, Sina walked in silence, shoulders hunched, hands trembling as they clutched the fabric of her skirt. Eventually, she couldn't hold it in anymore and confessed, "Amadou, maybe they're right. Maybe I really am just one more mouth to feed. Not even my parents wanted me. Why would the rest of the village accept me? Her voice came out weak but heavy with pain. Amada stopped in the middle of the dirt path, turned to her and spoke with quiet firmness. Senna, listen to me. People will always talk. And those too afraid to live speak the loudest. They don't know our pain. They don't know what we carry. We are not to reject. We are two survivors. And survivors don't owe anyone an explanation. His words stood like a wall against the storm of judgment. Even so, the villager's tongue was cruel. In the days that followed, news stories kept circulating. Some said Senna had been given away as punishment, that Amadou had taken her in because he'd no better choice. Others muttered that their union was a sign of failure, that poverty would only grow heavier now with two mouths to feed. In the midst of all these voices, Sina felt like she was walking over hot coals, each step burning a bit more of her dignity. One evening, sitting on the doorstep, silent tears ran down her cheeks. Omder, turning from the fields, noticed the sadness in her eyes. He sat beside her and said calmly, "You know, Senna, when I was a boy, people said I wouldn't live, that I'd die of hunger before I turned 15. But here I am. Their words didn't kill me, and these words now, they won't kill us either." She looked into his eyes and saw the truth in them. It didn't erase the pain of judgment, but it gave her strength to face it. "And what if they never accept us?" she asked, voice trembling. Armado gave a faint, tired smile, but it was steady. "Then we'll keep walking side by side, even if the whole world stands against us. Because it's better to walk with someone who understands you than to be surrounded by people who only know how to point fingers." Time went on, and though the whispers never stopped, Sina began to lift her head little by little. She discovered that the cruel tongue of the village held no greater power than the strength being born within her. She still felt shame, still heard from the words, but she no longer walked alone. Armadou was by her side, and that presence was stronger than all the judgment they faced. And so in that village where everyone believed that two outcasts had no future, a new story was beginning to be written. A story of resistance built on silence and dignity, where every step taken together was a challenge thrown at the cruelty of sharp tongues. And little by little, Sina discovered that the greatest victory wasn't to silence others, but to never let their words silence her own hope. The sun had barely risen when Amadou and Senna prepared to head to the village market. He carried a few vegetables harvested from his small plot, and she, still shy, held a basket of roots she had helped dig up. For Senna, this would be her first direct encounter with the community, since she had been handed off like a burden. Her heart pounded as if every step toward the square were a walk through fire. She knew the village eyes would be on her, ready to judge her, to size her up, to remind her of old wounds. The market was the village's beating heart. There were makeshift wooden stalls, colorful cloths strung up for shade, children darting between baskets of fruit, and women selling fresh fish beside piles of corn. The air was thick with the smells of roasted cassava, spices, and the damp earth from the night before. But for Senna, none of it held beauty. All she heard were whispers. All she felt was stares. She walked beside Amidou, trying to keep her face composed. Still, every step was shadowed by muffled laughter. "That's her, the rejected one," muttered a woman carrying a water jug. "Look at her size! Even the market's too crowded with her in it," another said, not bothering to lower her voice. Sina's chest burned, but she swallowed the tears like someone swallowing stones. They decided to stop at Zacchaeus' stall, a vendor known for his sharp tongue and little respect for the poor. Amidou handed over a few coins to buy flour, while Senna stepped forward to choose what they needed. Zaya looked her over from head to toe, a sneer forming at the corner of his mouth. "I don't serve her kind," he said loudly, making sure everyone around could hear. The silence that followed was cruel. Senna froze, heart pounding, hands trembling as she held her basket. She didn't know whether to walk away or stand her ground. The words echoed inside her like she was a child again, hearing Enzilan Rufino say she was a useless weight. She lowered her eyes, ready to retreat. But at that moment, Armadou stepped forward, in a firm voice loud enough for the entire market to hear. He declared, "Anyone who can't show respect doesn't deserve a single coin." His tone wasn't angry. It was steady, the voice of someone whose dignity had been wounded, but not broken. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some laughed, others fell silent, surprised by Amadou's boldness. Zaya, red with embarrassment, tried to explain. "I just meant," but the young man cut him off, slipping the coins back into his pouch. "Respect comes first, then comes business." Sina lifted her eyes slowly. For the first time in her life, someone hadn't just defended her. Someone had made her visible. Her face was still wet with held-back tears, but there was a new light in her gaze. The burden she carried felt a little lighter. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they'd lost their power as they walked to another stall. Senna felt her heart beating differently. No one had ever stood up for her before. She had always been left to fend for herself, always the target of insults with no one to shield her. But now, in front of the entire village, a man had stepped forward and said she was worthy of respect. That simple, powerful gesture changed something inside her. On the way home, the silence between them wasn't the same as before. Sina walked with her head held high even though her eyes were still red. Amadou noticed the shift and with a small smile said, "Don't lower your eyes, Sina. Anyone who carries dignity doesn't need to hide." She took a deep breath, and for the first time answered without fear. "Today I learned I'm not a burden. I learned I'm worth just as much as anyone else." Amadou's act hadn't silenced the villagers' cruel tongues, but it had planted a seed. Those who witnessed what happened at the market would never forget that day. Some still mocked, but others began to look at Senna with curiosity, even with respect. After all, not everyone had someone who would defend them with such courage. And so the market incident became Sina's first real moment of dignity. A moment that proved not just to the village, but to herself that a person's worth isn't measured by appearances or by malicious whispers, but by the quiet strength of someone who keeps existing, even after being rejected so many times. The days after the market were marked by a different kind of silence within Senna's heart. It was no longer the silence of suffocated pain, nor the one imposed by rejection and loneliness. It was a silence of reflection, the quiet that comes when someone for the first time has felt what it's like to be defended. Amadou's words echoed in her like a chant. Anyone who can't show respect doesn't deserve a coin. That phrase spoken before everyone had lifted her head. But even with that breath of dignity, a deep doubt lingered inside her. Did she truly have worth? Or was Amadou's gesture just a passing act of kindness? It was on a clear morning that this doubt began to dissolve. The sun lit the yard of their small home, and Amadou, already used to hard labor, invited Senna to help him in the fields. The soil needed tending, the plants watering, the heavy buckets pulled from the well. Senna, used to being treated like a burden, thought she wouldn't be good for that kind of work. Her body still carried the memory of all the mocking, the times she'd been told she was slow, lazy, useless. But Amadou called her naturally, without even a hint of judgment. "Come with me, Sina. The earth can always use 2 more hands." She hesitated, but the calm way he spoke gave her courage. She picked up a bucket, dipped it into the well, and began carrying the water to the garden. The weight was heavy, her arms ached, and sweat rolled down her face. But Senna didn't complain. Amadou watched from a distance, pretending to tend to other tasks. He knew these steps were about more than work. They were a reclamation of dignity. When she returned with the second bucket, her muscles were already trembling. But she kept going. That's when he approached, looked her in the eyes, and said with a sincere smile, "You've never lacked strength." Senna, it was just never recognized. The words were like cool water on dry earth. Senna paused, set the bucket down, and stood silently, holding back the emotion. For the first time, someone didn't see her size as a sign of useless weight, but a symbol of strength. She felt that her hands once used for unappreciated chores in Nzila's house, now had a different meaning. They were capable hands, building hands, hands that mattered. She took a deep breath and returned to work. But this time, the weight felt lighter. Every bucket she carried felt like a brick being removed from the wall of shame around her. The sweat was no longer humiliation, it was proof of worth. And when she caught a glimpse of Amadou watching her with respect in his eyes, Sina felt something she had never felt before: pride in herself. That day there were no whispers from the village, no mocking neighbors. There was only the sound of water falling on dry earth, the distant songs of birds, and the quiet filling of Senna's heart with something she had long forgotten: hope. Amadou hadn't given her gifts, hadn't promised her riches, but he had given her something infinitely greater: the certainty that she had value. As the afternoon faded and they rested beneath the shade of a tree, Sina couldn't hold back her tears. But they weren't the same tears of old. These were tears of release. The tears of someone finally seeing herself as someone. "Thank you, Amadou," she said, her voice breaking. He just nodded, needing no big words. "No need to thank me. I'm only showing you what's always been in you." In that moment, Sina understood. Amadou's gaze wasn't one of pity. It was one of recognition. He didn't see her as a burden, but as a companion. And that changed the way she began to see herself. That simple gesture of inviting her to help. And the fields became a powerful seed planted in the heart of a woman who had grown up believing she was just one more mouth to feed. Now she was beginning to discover that she was strength. She was worth. She was a life in bloom. Time moved on in the village, and Sina's life was slowly taking a new direction. Beside Amadou, she was rediscovering a strength she never thought she had. Each day, through shared work in the fields and their simple coexistence, Invisible but steady bonds were being woven. But peace, as it often had in her life, would not last long. The shadow of the past, thought to be asleep, returned once again. And as always, it did not come in the form of longing or regret, but in cruelty and selfish interest. One afternoon, with the sun falling heavy over the hills, a loud knock shattered the stillness of the house. Senna, sifting corn kernels, froze when she heard the familiar voices. Her heart pounded. She would recognize those tones anywhere. It was Donna and Zella and Uncle Rufino, the same people who had discarded her like trash. Ahmad, you stood up, wiped his hands of clay, and went to the door. Opening it, he found the couple standing there with expressions full of arrogance, as if they still held some right over Sina's fate. "We've come to take back what's ours," Enzila said bluntly. Hearing those words felt her knees go weak. Rafino added, "That girl left our house with things that didn't belong to her. We think it's best she gives them back before the whole village finds out about the thief you're hiding here." The accusation struck like lightning. Sina's eyes widened, stunned by what she was hearing. She had left with nothing but old clothes, and now she was being accused of theft. Armadu's blood boiled. He stepped forward, placing himself between Senna and her accusers. His voice, steadier than ever, echoed through the room. "She didn't take anything from your house. She left carrying only the contempt and humiliation you gave her, and no one wants that." His words struck deep, and for a moment even the wind seemed to go quiet. But Denzila didn't back down. Her face hard and unmoved. She tried to press the accusation. "She's ungrateful. She ate our rice, drank our water, and now plays the victim." Sina couldn't hold back any longer. With tears streaming down her face, she responded, "You never gave me love. You never gave me a place. I was just an extra mouth to feed. Never a daughter. And even so, I never took anything except the pain you gave me." The argument drew curious neighbors who began gathering to watch. Whispers rose behind doors. "What do you think she stole?" Some cruel snickered, others simply observed in silence. Dot, sensing the danger of false accusations, Armadu raised his voice even more. "If there's justice in this village, then let the truth be known. Whoever accuses must prove it. And I say, before everyone here, Senna stole nothing. She was discarded like scraps. But here she is, treated like a human being. And I will not allow anyone to stay in her name with lies." The tension was thick in the air. The couple, shaken by Armadu's resolve, still tried to insist, but they no longer had the same grip. The villagers, though divided, began to question if there had really been a theft. Why hadn't Enzela and Rafino said anything before? Why wait so long to make such a claim? Their arrogance began to crumble into suspicion in the eyes of the community. Sina, who had always remained silent in the face of humiliation, found her courage, wiping her tears. She stepped forward and stood beside Amidu. "You can accuse me of anything. You can call me a burden, useless, whatever you want, but I won't be called a thief. I've carried the shame you gave me long enough. That one I won't carry anymore." Her voice trembled, but her resolve surprised even herself. The silence that followed was more powerful than any insult. Rafi, caught off guard, cleared his throat but had no reply. Enzila tried to hold her ground, but the mask of authority was cracking. It was clear they had no proof, only the same old tactic of humiliating to maintain control. "Ahmad, you closed the door, firm but not violent." He turned to Senna and said calmly, "Here. No one accuses without truth. Here your story won't be written by liars." She collapsed into tears, but this time they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of relief. For the first time, someone had defended her, not behind closed doors, but in front of her very tormentors. That night, the weight she carried felt lighter, but the battle wasn't over. The cruel visit from her former family had planted new questions in the village's mind, and as always, sharp tongues were already crafting new stories. What Senna didn't know was that the truth buried for years was about to come to light in the hands of someone she least expected. The accusations hurled by Donazilla and Uncle Rufino didn't vanish, eased by the flavor of gossip. Words traveled faster than the wind, and on every corner the story grew a little more. Some said Sina had stolen hidden jewelry. Others claimed she took money tucked away in the bottom of a gourd. Each version more absurd than the last. But they all shared the same thing. A finger pointed at the young woman who had never been given the right to defend herself. For days, Senna walked with her head held high, trying to stay strong under the weight of suspicious glances. But inside, her heart bled. How could she prove her innocence to people who always wanted to believe the worst? Ahmed was her only shield, he repeated loud and clear. Every time someone insinuated something, she didn't take anything. And I owe no explanations to people who live off gossip. But still, the shadow of doubt lingered in the air. Then the most unlikely voice in the village rose to bring light to what so many had ignored. Tia Munda, an elderly woman with a soft voice but a razor-sharp memory, appeared at the market one late afternoon. Her wrinkled skin, slow steps, supported by a cane, and steady eyes bore the look of someone who had seen too much. She walked to the center of the square where many were buying cassava and fresh fish, and asked for silence. "Listen closely, neighbors," she began, her voice but clear. "For years I've held on to a truth many chose not to see, but now the time has come to speak." The buzz of conversation died down, and all eyes turned to her. Enzela and Rufino, who were also there, tried to hide their discomfort, but their faces palled. Tiamunda raised her cane and pointed toward the couple. "That girl you call a thief. She was always used as a shield for their greed. You know why? Because Enzela and Rufino received aid from the government and the churches to care for her. They got sacks of rice, corn, even cash. But they never shared it with the girl. They kept it all for themselves. While she ate leftovers and wore torn clothes, a murmur swept through the crowd. The whispers now had a new target. Some recalled seeing trucks deliver donations to Rufino's home, but few had ever questioned where it all went. I saw it with my own eyes. The old woman continued. "I helped carry the sacks myself, all labeled for Senna, but I never once saw her with a full plate. Never once saw her in new clothes. The help meant for the orphan filled only their pots, and now they dare accuse her of stealing." Tiaman's words fell like stones into a still river. The villagers, once suspicious of Senna, now turned to Enzela and Rafino with anger and disgust. A woman in the crowd shouted, "So it was you stealing all along." Another added, "The girl was always the victim and you still have the nerve to call her a thief." The couple tried to respond, but the voices of the crowd drowned out their excuses. Senna, listening with tears in her eyes, felt as though a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Her whole life had been marked by rejection. And now finally the truth shone bright before everyone. She didn't need long speeches to defend herself. The truth had come from someone with memory, courage, and nothing to gain. Armadu placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Fate may take its time, but it never fails." Sina wept, not from shame, but from relief. For the first time, the village could clearly see who had been the real burden. Not her, but those who had exploited her while pretending to be charitable. Enzila and Rufino, humiliated, tried to slip away, but the villagers' stares followed them like burning brands. There was no prestige left, no respect. All that remained were the shattered masks of authority. Broken before the eyes of the entire community, the unexpected revelation changed everything. Sina was no longer seen as one more mouth to feed. She was recognized as the victim of a cruel injustice. Amadu earned even more respect for having defended her from the beginning, even without proof, and Tiamunda, with her honest tongue and rare courage, became the guardian of the truth the village had needed to hear. That day, it wasn't just Senna who was set free. It was the entire community that learned to look beyond appearances to understand that often the real thieves are the ones who hide behind masks of authority. The unexpected revelation was more than a defense. It was justice happening in plain sight. After Tiamunda's revelation, the village was never the same. The masks had fallen, and what once were whispers against Sina now turned into murmurs against Enzila and Rufina. The two who for years had fed their pride on the false image of being caretakers lost all their prestige. It was as if doors that were once open now slammed in their faces, and respectful glances had turned into scorn. But for Setna, victory didn't come with celebration or public praise. It came in silence in the rhythm of simple days, worked side by side with a Madhu dot in that packed earthy yard where seeds were planted and watered with sweat. Life began to bloom in a new way. Senna learned how to plant cassava, tend the garden, and work the land with her own hands. She discovered that her body, once mocked and ridiculed, was also her strength. The weight they had long criticized became endurance, power, the ability to carry what many could not. And Amadu, ever observant, made sure to acknowledge each effort. "Look, Senna," he'd say, "see how the earth responds to your care. That's no small thing. That's life being born from your hands." Little by little, the house that once looked abandoned took the shape of a home. Themod walls were patched with care. A new thatched roof was added. The garden grew green and abundant. Every small achievement brought shared joy. They had nothing to prove to anyone. But without realizing it, they were showing the village that dignity doesn't need applause to exist. The neighbors began to notice the change. At first, some still wrinkled their noses, clinging to the memory of Sina's rejection. But seeing her and Amadu walking together, heads held high with their harvest baskets full, they could no longer deny it. There was a strength there that shattered every insult. One day, a man from the village commented, "She was cast aside, but look at her now. She seems happier than those who cast her out." Others nodded in quiet agreement. It was undeniable Sina's victory wasn't made of shouts, but of daily quiet actions. It was in the care for the land, in the heavy bucket lifted with steady hands, in the meals now seasoned with triumph, and in the soft smile shared beside Amadou. Every detail was a reminder that a person's worth isn't defined by others. It's built with their own hands, and Zella and Rufino meanwhile tasted the bitterness of disgrace. Where they once walked and were greeted with smiles, now they were met with murmurs and closed doors. Justice didn't come through courts or punishments. The truth was enough to strip them of the community's respect. And that was the cruelest punishment, to live surrounded by eyes that once honored them but now saw through them. But Senna refused to let bitterness take root. Though the scars were deep, her heart was beginning to fill with something new. Gratitude. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted peace, far from the shadow of rejection. So when she passed through the village and heard whispers about the couple who'd raised her, she didn't smile in triumph. She simply kept walking. Her victory was silent, and perhaps that's what made it so powerful. Over time, the children of the village began running through Amadou's yard, asking for fruit from the garden, laughing near the well. And Senna, watching them, remembered the girl she once was, rejected and humiliated. Now she could offer what she had never received. Welcome. Not riches, not expensive gifts, but something greater. Respect and affection. And that was enough to turn her pain into strength. In this way, Sina's victory wasn't written in big letters, but in the simple lines of everyday life. It was built with sweat, with dignity, and with the courage to stay standing, even when everyone wanted her to fall. It was a victory that didn't need trumpets or crowds, just the gaze of those who now saw not one more mouth to feed, but a whole woman, strong and capable, who had lifted her life up from the dust. In the quiet of those ordinary days, Senna finally understood that fate had given her back something she thought was lost. Her honor. And each night, as she lay down, exhausted, yet at peace, she knew that her greatest triumph wasn't in defeating those who had scorned her. It was in finally finding within herself the dignity she had always been denied. Time moved slowly in the village. Days repeated themselves in the rhythm of work, the rising and setting of the sun, the rains that fed the earth. But for Sina and Amadou, each day was a new thread into the fabric of their lives. What began as shelter and solidarity slowly became companionship, then friendship, and little by little, without either of them planning it, something much deeper. There were no promises whispered by lamplight, nor rehearsed declarations. The feeling grew in the silence of shared mornings, in the weight of water buckets carried together. In the evenings, when Amadou came home from the fields exhausted, and Sina was already waiting with a warm meal, love didn't knock on the door asking permission. It didn't announce its arrival. It simply bloomed quietly, like a hidden root that suddenly bursts into green before the eyes. Sina began noticing the little things. The way Amadou paused his work to place a blanket over her shoulders when the cold wind came. How he always saved the best part of the harvest for her, even when there wasn't enough for both of them. And most of all, the way he looked at her. A gaze that didn't weigh or judge, but simply saw her. That look made her feel alive, whole, desired for the first time. Amadou, in turn, noticed the changes within himself. The solitude that had always followed him seemed to dissolve. The house, once quiet and cold, now echoed with footsteps, soft laughter. Even the gentle songs Senna hummed as she worked. "I didn't find burden in you, Sina," he said one evening after a long day as she helped him mend a fallen fence. "I found rest." She wept when she heard those words. Not from sadness, but from relief. Her whole life, she'd been called a burden, dead weight, a leftover. And now someone was saying the opposite, that in her there was rest through tears. She replied, "And I didn't find weight in you." Amadou I found home. It was a simple moment with no witnesses, but it sealed something between them that the village could never measure or judge. Gradually, the villagers began to notice the transformation. They no longer saw two castaways surviving together. They saw two hearts that had found in each other what the world had once denied them. Some still mocked in silence, but even they were forced to admit. There was real love between them, steady and strong like stone. Senna and Amadou's love wasn't made of grand gestures, but of small everyday details. It lived in the bread they shared, in the swept floor, in the smile exchanged at the end of a tiring day. It was a love that didn't need witnesses to exist, and yet it was visible to all. In the village, new kinds of comments began to circulate. When someone said she was rejected, others would now reply, "And she's happier than those who rejected her." It was a recognition long overdue, but meaningful. After all, what better proof of someone's worth than their ability to turn rejection into affection, pain into tenderness, and loneliness into home? For Senna, that love didn't erase the past, but it redeemed it. The wounds still existed, but now there were hands that touched them gently. For Amadou, love didn't erase the loneliness he had carried for so many years, but it gave it meaning, turning each day into a victory over pain. And together, without needing to explain or justify, they built a refuge where once there had only been absence. Thus, in the rhythm of a simple life, a love was born. One no one expected, one no one believed was possible. A love that didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for the perfect moment, didn't care what the village had to say. It simply bloomed naturally as if it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to rise. And among the packed earth, the cleared, and the quiet of the nights, Senna and Amadou discovered that sometimes the greatest miracle is not to be loved by the whole world, but to be loved deeply by just one person. Time passed and the seasons changed in the village. The rain came and went. The crops grew and were harvested. And with them, so too grew the new life of Senna and Amadou. What had begun in pain and humiliation had become something neither of them nor anyone else could have foreseen. A home filled with dignity, respect, and love. And in the quiet justice of life, each person in that story reaped exactly what they had sown. Enzela and Rafina, who once prided themselves on a false image of kindness, watched their reputation crumble in the light of truth. Each step they took through the village was no longer met with respectful greetings, but with stares of reproach. Doors that had once opened now remained shut. Neighbors who once flattered them now kept their distance. They were no longer remembered for generosity, but for greed, not for love, but for cruelty. The village's collective memory condemned them, and no wealth or lie could erase that mark. Meanwhile, Senna, the girl who had grown up being called just one more mouth to feed, now walked with her head held high. She no longer needed elaborate defenses because her life spoke for itself. The respect she had once been denied bloomed in every simple gesture. In the children who came running to pick fruit from her garden, in the women who came seeking her advice, in the men who now greeted her with genuine admiration. Her victory wasn't made of trophies or titles, but of dignity earned with sweat and courage. Amadou, the once lonely young man, also reaped the fruits of his kindness. The one who had grown up without a father, without a mother, without a home, now found in Senna the family he had always been denied. His house, once filled with silence and solitude, had become a place of warmth and sharing. There were laughs, there were voices, there was the music of pots bubbling on the fire and the scent of freshly baked bread in the air. The emptiness in his life had been filled not by crowds, but by the presence of someone who understood him. The village, in turn, learned a lesson that would echo for generations. They came to see that rejection does not erase worth, that mockery does not define destiny, and that appearances do not measure dignity. Life showed right before their eyes that contempt is often just the prologue to the most unexpected encounters. And fate, though it may seem delayed, never fails the just. One evening, as the day faded into dusk, Senna and Amadou sat together on the doorstep of their home. The sky was painted red and gold, and a soft wind blew across the yard. She held his hand and said quietly, "Who would have thought that cruel handover would be the beginning of everything?" He smiled and replied, "Sometimes it's in rejection that life leads us to what really matters." And in that shared silence, they both understood. They no longer had anything to prove. They didn't need the village's acceptance, nor the approval of those who had once cast them aside. Their greatest victory had already been won. The victory of having found each other, of having transformed pain into strength, loneliness into companionship, burden into peace, rejection into home. And so in the very village that had so often judged them, they remained as a quiet example. That dignity is never truly lost, even when it is denied. That love can be born without asking permission. That life, with all its unexpected turns, always prepares the kind of meeting the human heart can't foresee. In the end, Enzila and Rafino were remembered with disdain, but Sina and Amadou, they were remembered not as outcasts, but as to souls who came together to prove that true wealth lies in respect, in courage, and in love. Fate had placed them in the middle of a bitter trial, but it had also led them to the greatest reward of all, the realization that for those who've carried the weight of rejection, to find shelter in someone's heart is the purest form of victory. And the village, after so much watching and witnessing, kept a new saying that echoed through the evening gatherings. Sometimes it's through rejection that life prepares us for a true encounter. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our